All right, let's get going. Hi, I am Dr. Jacob Larson, and this is Read, Write, and Cite, channel where I teach you how to read, write, and cite for your college classes. It's the evening of July 3rd, and I'm getting ready to start a new online class. And as I was updating some of my materials, I realized because we changed the textbook, I no longer have content that's explaining some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video. So I want to make sure I cover that in this video. We're going to be talking about literary elements. Literary elements is a term that throws a lot of people. There's probably a lot of terms we could use for it instead. Strategies, something like that. It's the kinds of things that we talk about when we try to break apart and analyze literature. So, literature. If I'm talking about a story, or I'm talking about a poem, or say a play, if I'm talking about anything like that, that's literature, right? And if I'm trying to talk about the plot or the characters or the story, I'm talking about literary elements. These are things which specifically the authors use as a strategy to get their point across, whatever that is. If they're trying to convey a certain meaning or give a message, they're going to use all these different elements, hopefully effectively, together to make a point. All right, so let's go through some of these, explain a couple, just so we kind of get an idea. All right. There's a lot of different kinds of literary elements that we talk about specifically when it comes to fiction. If we're talking about fiction, we're going to be talking about things like plot. Plot is not what the story is about. And I want to make sure I clarify that because it confuses a lot of my students. Plot is what happens. It's kind of like the events in the story. So if you just saw a TV show, a movie, or whatever, and your friend's like, oh yeah, tell me about that. And if you start telling them what happens, you're telling them the plot. But if you start saying what you think about it, you're no longer discussing the plot. You've moved on to some sort of opinion, some sort of analysis. It's not the same thing. And that's important to distinguish, especially if you're writing a paper about fiction. There's going to be an appropriate time for you to discuss elements, an appropriate time maybe, depending on what your teacher's asking for you to discuss things like what you think about what you read. Okay. I'm using my textbook as a reference. This is Backpack Literature by X.J. Kennedy and Dana, I'm not going to say the name right, Gaia, something like that. 14th edition. This is the textbook I used to use at my college. We've moved on to something else now. Okay. So the literary elements we're most comfortable talking about are things like character, plot, setting, right? So let's hit each of those. We talked about plot real fast. Let's talk about character. Character are the people, the figures, whether they are animated. I mean, they could be a bird, they could be, I don't know, a mythical creature, whatever. But they are the things that the story are about. They're the ones moving around. They're performing the action of the plot. Does that make sense? So if I'm talking about a main character, this person wants to do this character wants to do that, this brave little toaster did this, whatever. It doesn't have to be realistic, right? But it is something that is moving and doing something in the story. Ultimately, your story is going to be about characters and what they do and their relationships with other people and how much these characters do or do not grow. Make sense? Ultimately, that's what a story does. They're going to convey some sort of message through the actions, the things that characters do. It's kind of a cool thing about stories because we can relate to characters. We're going to take those things that we know, that we understand from our own lives, and we're going to relate to that. Even if it's, a fish lost in the ocean, or, a robot on a deserted planet. Does these sound like movies you've seen? Maybe. Okay, so that's character. Point of view. That's how the story is being told, the perspective that the story is being told from. So you're going to hear first person, second person, third person limited, third person omniscient. Those are your four basic points of view that a story might be told from. If the person telling the story is in the story, that's first person, right? So if I'm going to tell you about my day, I'm going to say, well, I woke up, I was kind of tired, I did this. That's first person, right? When you're speaking directly to the audience, that's second person. When you say you or we or us, you're now speaking directly to the audience, the listener, the reader. That's second person. And if you're talking about someone else, that's third person. Some stories, the narrator isn't necessarily a character, they just kind of know everything. And if they're talking about the thoughts and the feelings, the kinds of things you don't know just by looking at someone of multiple characters, we call that third person omniscient, meaning they kind of know everything. If it's just following someone else, but like maybe one someone else, and it's only focusing on their thoughts and feelings, we call that third person limited, because the narration is limited to just that one person's thoughts and feelings. Makes sense? That's point of view. Setting. Setting is where the story takes place and when the story takes place. This is important because this is the context that frames the story and makes it possible, right? If I'm going to talk about Finding Nemo, the movie, right? You've got two clownfish in the ocean. And there's the dad, he's kind of possessive and controlling. The son, he wants to go out and see the world, right? Well, they get separated through circumstance, and now dad has to go find the son, and the son has to find his way back, and they have to find each other. That's the setting. That's kind of the plot and the setup. That's kind of the big ideas. The setting is where it's taking place. Well, it's in the ocean, right? Where specifically in the ocean? It's on the Great Barrier Reef, off the coast of Australia. That's where the story takes place. Could the same story take place in Arizona? No, because we're talking about a fish crossing the ocean, right? Could you have a similar story? The animal trying to cross the desert. Yes, you could do that, right? But sometimes it is the location and the place that makes the story possible. If you think about something like Harry Potter, it takes place in the real world, sort of, but they introduce all sorts of magic and mythology and other things to the world that we already know. So it may take place in England and, Scotland, places like that, but then they add a layer on top of it. Now there's this place called Hogwarts, and at this school of witchcraft and wizardry there's all these magical things that happen. Meanwhile, each story takes place in the Muggle world, the normal world. And then they go back to this magical world where magical things can happen. And setting is really important. When does it take place? Basically the modern day, right? Now, if we took that story and we stuck it in the past, it's a little bit of a different story. And that's what they've done with the Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them series of movies. These two that have come out so far, they take place, in like the 1930s-ish, right? So it's a little bit different story, but it's still in the same world. Those things affect the story and control what's possible. In that setting, magic is possible. So it creates a magical story. You with me so far? Okay. Tone, style. If a style, maybe we think of something like genre, right? Genre, you have mysteries, you have romances, you have a lot of different kinds of stories, and they may have a different tone and a different style associated with them. When we're talking about fiction, a really defined style is called pulp fiction, which you may have heard of a movie by that name, right? It's kind of a very specific kind of character and tone, and it's dark, and people aren't perfect, and people do things for bad reasons, and the characters aren't all necessarily good people, but that's appropriate for the tone and the style of that genre. Um, if we're reading a romance novel, we're going to want to in this kind of heightened emotional environment, these people and them overcoming adversity to be with each other. Sounds like Romeo and Juliet, right? The tone and style can inform a lot about the story, and the author who uses those strategies also gives us kind of an idea for the world that we are part of, so we know what to expect. Theme. Theme is something I have a lot of trouble explaining, and it really throws a lot of my students. So I'm just going to read out of the book what it says. The way I like to define theme isn't always the easiest one to understand. Plot is what happens. Characters are the ones performing the action of the plot, and the theme is what the story is about. Now, we may get confused because when we think about, we're thinking the things that are happening. No. Theme is the ideas that kind of connect everything and give it its importance or its significance. Okay, so I'm going to read what this says. I'm trying to skip ahead. Now let's just take it from the beginning. A theme of a story is whatever general idea or insight the entire story reveals. In some stories, the theme is unmistakable. At the end of Aesop's fable about the council of the mice that can't decide who will bell the cat, the theme is stated in the moral. It is easier to propose a thing than to carry it out. I don't want us to get confused. There's Aesop's fables in the beginning of this book, which is why it's referencing it. But a theme and a moral are not always the same thing. You can have a theme that doesn't give a lesson. A moral is going to be a lesson, but not every story's themes will teach you something. Does that make sense? So if we get back to, say, Romeo and Juliet, what are some of the ideas that connect everything? We can say love conquers all, or, teenagers make stupid decisions when they're motivated by love. I don't know. But there can be more than one theme to a story, right? If you can kind of explain the ideas that connect things that are happening, that's what a theme is, right? Okay. Next section, plot versus theme. It describes what a summary is, and then okay, like what I was just saying, a theme not be a moral or a message. It may be what the events add up to, what the story is about, which is kind of the definition that I usually use. A theme aims for a deeper and more comprehensive statement of its larger meaning. So yes, that sounds a lot like moral, but a theme is kind of what are all the parts and pieces? What do they mean? Kind of it's not necessarily a lesson or a message, but maybe. Probably not very helpful, is that? Sorry. Okay. Symbolism. It's when something that's happening kind of has a deeper message or meaning, right? One thing means something else. Let me give you an example. The character of Superman has evolved over time. And some of the times that Superman is portrayed, he represents kind of a savior character, someone who is there to save the earth, comes from unusual parentage, falls from the sky. It sounds like the Christ story, right? You could argue that Superman is kind of like a savior character. He's symbolic of a deity, a god, or something like that. Does that make sense? We see one thing, but it kind of can mean something bigger, something different than what the story is saying explicitly. And it requires the audience to kind of infer it. Symbolism. Okay, those are some of the ideas that are kind of specific to fiction. So, how do we put all this together? Well, if I was writing a paper about fiction, let's say I pick a story and I'm reading through it, here's what I would do. I would look for something that stands out to me. If I think, oh, this tone is really interesting, or I'm like, well, that character is interesting. I wonder why he does that. Or the setting, the location is really interesting. Those might be the things I want to talk about in my paper. And I'm going to think, okay, why did the author choose these things? How does it help to move the story along? Was it effective? Was it not effective? And then I might explain that in the paper. And I'm going to find something I can say about it, something that is my opinion that is debatable, that I can argue about it. And that's what I would make my paper about. So if I'm going to talk about A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, which is a story by Ernest Hemingway, and I want to talk about how the setting is symbolic, right? I put two of those things together. It's in the name, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. There's this guy, he's drunk at a bar and he doesn't want to go home because, well, there's light at the bar and home is dark. Okay, so what's the symbolism? Well, light, represents life. Maybe it's happiness. Home is dark and sad and depressed, and he doesn't want to go home, be sad. And you've got these two waiters who are just kind of talking about this guy who's drunk at the bar and how one wants him to go home and the other one's like, let him be, right? And then they talk about it, and it relates these ideas. I could write a paper about that. I'm focusing on the setting and how the setting is symbolic of something else. That could be a paper. The reason why we do this is we're learning how to look past what is just on the surface. This is what we do in any sort of literary analysis or analysis of literature. We're not trying to find a correct answer because ultimately anything in literature is going to be an interpretation. And interpretations don't have to be the only possible takeaway, right? Because anyone who reads a story might take away something different. And the whole purpose in you reading the story and saying what you have to think, what you think about it, is to give your perspective, your analysis, which isn't so much that you have to go find the one true answer out there. You're just sharing your ideas. And so long as you can justify it, you can explain it with examples from the text, maybe an outside source or two, and a good breakdown, that's good enough. You don't have to go find what the correct answer is. You don't even have to worry about what the author intended. You just have to state it. And this is important. You don't need to say, I think this, I feel this, I believe this. It's not necessary. Because in a literary analysis, it doesn't matter, right? You're presenting a perspective. It doesn't matter if you agree with it or you disagree with it. If you think it, you feel it, you believe it. You're presenting an idea. And the reader's job is to go, okay, that's an interesting idea. I agree with you. I don't agree with you. And that's it. You're just presenting perspective. Make sense? I hope that was helpful. If you like this video and you want me to explain more things like poetry, well, I'm going to record that in just a couple minutes. And that'll be posted on the channel as well. I hope that this was helpful. If you have questions, feel free to ask me in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. I love answering everybody's questions. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, see videos like this. And if you think this would help someone else, please share it with your friends. So thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Jacob Larson. This has been Read, Write, and Cite. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.